Hello world, you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. On the 22nd of April, news emerged of a massive explosion inside the Afghan capital, Kabul. It has since emerged that the blast was the work of Islamic State. 57 people were killed and 100 were injured. According to the Afghan Public Health Ministry, of the killed, 22 were women and 8 were children. Of the injured, 52 were women and 17 were children. For Afghanistan, long used to the slaughter of its innocents in tribal, clan-based, terrorist-based atrocities, non-state versus state and state versus state violence, this sad statistic is just another day in the life of the Afghan people. Afghanistan has a barely functional government, highly organized and motivated anti-government groups, most finding their backing from a multitude of foreign powers and interests, none with the interests of the Afghan people at heart. Since 2001, billions of dollars have been spent by the US and its allies on trying to reconstruct Afghanistan into something akin to a modern country. Where that money has gone is anyone's guess, though corruption among local government officials is rife, and for those Western companies outsourced to do the work of governments, a lack of proper accountability layered by a Byzantine labyrinth of networks within networks led to a far more insidious and sophisticated form of corruption at a strategic level, which has left Afghanistan in no better condition than it was when under Soviet occupation, and arguably in many ways much worse. When we first broached this topic on Strategikon with Professor Albert Wolff some 10 months ago, Albert, who works at the American University in Kabul, painted a bleak picture of Afghanistan and its future. Today we decided to revisit this topic with Professor Wolff, following on from the recent spike in terrorist attacks in the country. We are joined also by SIA's resident existentialist philosopher David Olney. Unfortunately, research assistant Shahrazad Ghairat can't be with us in the studio today owing to work commitments, but she has sent in a couple of questions which I will ask on her behalf. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategikon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Albert, welcome back to Strategikon. Great having you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Albert, if I could start off by saying earlier this month, on 9th of April, ISIS leader in Afghanistan, otherwise known as Islamic State in Khorasan, Kari Hekmatullah, was killed by an airstrike in Faryab province. Can we say that this has had any real operational or political impact on Islamic State in Afghanistan?
I would say a couple of things. I say, first of all, contrary to the adage that a week is a very long time in politics, a week is really too short a period of time. Now, first of all, generally speaking, there is a finding that drone strikes have had a positive effect on degrading terrorist organizations in places like Pakistan. I can't say though that we can say that it's had that effect in ISIS-K or ISIS-Khorasan, just because it's been too short a period of time. The second thing is that, extrapolating from the findings in Pakistan, there's necessarily been fewer people joining or how can I say it, fewer people or more people leaving the organization, if that makes sense. So it's sort of my best guess would be that it has contained the organization.
In terms of the difference between Pakistan and Afghanistan, could we sort of read into that perhaps that in Pakistan, where there is something resembling normality, drone strikes have a greater impact on the organisation because people can find another way to have a life. They don't necessarily need to be involved in an organisation like the Taliban. Whereas in Afghanistan, because war has been such a constant state, could we argue that drone strikes are more likely to foment greater problems and greater commitment and a greater desire for a grudge match versus the West?
I'm not sure. Do you mind rephrasing the question? I mean, are you trying to say that drone strikes are more likely to be effective in Afghanistan.
No,
than
the
in
opposite.
Pakistan.
That really in Pakistan, because there is an alternative way to have a life, because violence is not everywhere, that drone strikes do seem to have some impact. Whereas I would wonder in Afghanistan, because of constant wars, literally since 1979, if it's a case where war is just so normalised now that a drone strike, all it does is change the leader. It doesn't really change people's level of motivation.
It's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that, and there really isn't enough data to really answer that question intelligently, because it's so hard to do any sort of groundwork. I would say that there is some evidence that leadership decapitation in general does have an impact, because it forces the organization to look for somebody else, and it does impose a cost. It has, but you do make a good point that with respect to Afghanistan, war has been much more normalized than it has been in many other places. That's true.
Albert, while we were waking up to the news that the Trump White House had bombed 3 alleged Syrian chemical warfare sites, 26 Afghan security officers were killed and 2 schools were burnt down in a series of attacks last weekend. The Afghan government has claimed that the Taliban was behind these attacks. Do you have any further information to corroborate this allegation?
I don't have any further information except to say that, I'm sorry to say that, usually whenever the Afghan government gives a casualty count, the rule of thumb is to multiply by 3. So it's usually, probably more like 75 or even 80 people were probably killed as opposed to 26.
With casualty figures being so hard to quantify in Afghanistan, do we see the impact directly on the population? Like, is this part of the reason for economic growth being almost impossible? Is this part of the reason why people just cannot get past the thing of trusting family, clan, tribe? That the casualty level is just so consistently high, underreported, and so socially significant that there's no real way to sort of expand government influence over the population, build trust, because the constant effect of casualties is just so traumatic on the population.
Well, I think that it's clearly part of the reason. Part of the reason is that you have a government that simply cannot establish itself. You have a government that is, we talk of a government, but in reality, Ashraf Ghani isn't even mayor of Kabul in many respects. You look at, all the problems within the government itself. You take one issue like corruption, which itself is extremely hard to tackle in any country. You have corruption running up and down throughout the Afghan national security forces. Excuse me. That's part of the reason why. There was a horrible attack last year. Soldiers were, or members of the security forces were paid off by members of the Taliban. They were given, their trucks, their uniforms, and so on. Part of the reason for economic growth is things like high transaction costs. Yes, it is the ongoing violence, but it's also all of the problems with corruption, and it's all of the problems. All of the problems that are endemic to, again, high transaction costs. A state that can't do very basic things like raise taxes. A state that just can't function, and a state that's at odds with itself. This coalition government, which between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah is barely functioning. They were supposed to be 2 parliamentary elections. They were canceled both times. There's supposed to be an election this summer, and most people are very doubtful that will take place. So, part of it is the fact that you have a government that is just not working. And it isn't just because of the issues of terrorism and war. it's because of issues of corruption and political opportunism.
Yeah, it's very sad that we used to be able to make the joke that Karzai was the mayor of Kabul, and yet now we can't now it's just sad that we can't say anyone is the mayor of Kabul, that it's sunk to the level where the corruption and the disorganisation is so extreme. Lately in Australia, we've been getting a little bit of footage of the Afghan commandos, and the footage has very much been trying to portray that their competence level has increased significantly, and that sort of their effectiveness in the field, I think is being sold to us that, we've still got training teams there, that the training teams are getting some sort of positive outcomes to make up for the fact we can't do a damn thing for the Afghani government. Is there any local evidence that the competence of Afghan Special Forces is getting any better? Are they the one good news story, or is that about as hollow as the power of the presidency?
I think it's the latter. I mean, what are the results on the battlefield? I mean, a lot of this to me, my instinct is, what is the evidence of the battlefield? My instinct is that this is propaganda.
Yeah, because that's all we're getting here is footage that looks like someone was in a firefight, but we get no explanation that it achieved anything of any value. So it's just desperate last resort for a multi-year deployment to try and justify something.
Following on from this point, President Ghani has just argued for the raising of territorial troops in Afghanistan. We talked about friendly fire, we talked about the corruptible nature of the ANA, we talk about the corruptible nature of the entire Afghan security infrastructure. Do you think we're going to be any better off in terms of Afghanistan security if a territorial army was to infuse the current establishment with more forces at a local level?
I actually don't think it's a bad idea, but it's not just the raising of forces, it's where you put them and what you do with them. If they were to put them in the NDS, then I think that, yes, that could do some good. Because part of the problem is that the NDS is the main unit that's used to, battle counterinsurgency. It's woefully undermanned. If they were to put them there, I think it could do some good. If they just put them under the regular Afghan, the regular Afghan army, no, I don't think it's going to change a thing. One other thing is that it's going to also depend upon whether or not they segregate them by ethnicity and then further segregate them by tribe. There's been some evidence from Chechnya that when the Russians used Chechen troops, for example, they got better results than by using Russian troops. So if they were, in my view, if they were to use, for example, Pashtun troops in, Pashtun areas, for example, they get better results than by using, sort of a multi-ethnic approach. So again, it's going to depend upon how they use them, how they employ them, and obviously where they employ them.
So really, they have to acknowledge the cultural splits across the country and leverage cultural knowledge and acceptance, but take the risk in doing so that all they do is create the most capable gangs in the same uniform ever.
Yes.
That's a rather cynical way of putting it.
Yes.
Albert, our research assistant Shahrazad Gairat isn't with us today, but she has sent a couple of questions across for you. The first of which is a strategic level question. Does the US have a moral obligation to stay the course and assist with the reconstruction of Afghanistan as it did in post-war Japan, in South Korea, West Germany? And could it also be seen as an ongoing occupation?
I think the answer to both those, on the moral level, yes. On the more strategic level, I think it's more of an open question. I mean, it's looking more and more. I hate to say it, it's looking more and more like a quagmire. And I'll be honest, I've written before that there were very good reasons for Trump to raise the troop level, the 5,000 troops, but it's a question of what are we achieving at this point, and what exactly does victory look like? Could you remind me of what the second part of her question was?
Well, the second part of the question is, could the ongoing US presence now be actually seen as nothing more than a military occupation?
I think it is seen as nothing more than as an occupation.
Yeah.
I think that's a very true. I think many people do see it as an occupation.
I hear that President Ghani has also signed up to the idea of getting the ANA redeployed for Gulf exercises with other Gulf state armed forces. Do you think that this is actually a good idea in terms of giving the ANA more broader experience and training?
I think it's an excellent idea. I don't see what they have to lose by doing it. I think that the more training that the ANA has, the better.
And particularly more training divorced from Americans, Australians, Canadians, French, anyone that looks like they were part of the problem.
Well, it's not so much that. I just think that, my impression is that they simply need more training. If they were to start training, say, with the Emiratis, for example, I don't see an issue with that. So, if they were to be able to have more training and to be able to execute more, operations, broadly speaking, on their own, I think it'd be a great thing, especially, I think it'd be a great thing.
When we spoke to you a few months ago, we discussed the highly factionalized nature of the Taliban. Have there been any further developments regarding the group's organizational capabilities? Are they still factionalized as heavily? Also, what can you say of the Taliban's relationship with Islamic State Khorasan today? Is it still as problematic as it was when we first broached the topic with you?
My understanding of the Taliban is that it is still as factionalized as it once was. That they're even under Mullah Omar, it's still as factionalized as ever. At one point in time, they had a series of tenuous alliances across the country with ISIS-K. I don't believe that those are holding like they once were. A few years ago. That's as far as I understand the relationship with ISIS.
Okay. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a critical part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, is well into development. Originally costed at about $40 billion, it's now anticipated to cost somewhere up in the vicinity of about $62 billion. Its impact on the Pakistani economy has been likened to the Marshall Plan, with the first phase of the CPEC due to be completed sometime this year. Has there been a net improvement in Pakistani security that you are aware of? And if so, has this had a positive effect on developments inside of Afghanistan?
There would be two parts of that. There has been a net, from what I understand about CPEC, One Belt, One Road, there has, the Pakistani corridor of it, there has been net improvements on it because China has demanded them. You may remember very early on in the program, I think 3 Chinese engineers were killed. And the Chinese were absolutely irate about it, and they demanded improvements in security. So the answer to that has been yes. Have there been improvements in the Afghan economy? Not that I can see. There's been wishful thinking that would happen, and of course there's been talk of expanding One Belt, One Road into Afghanistan, but I have not heard or seen anything to that effect.
Albert, do you think we could assume that the situation in Afghanistan for accessing minerals will end up being a little bit like what has happened in Africa? So we have the example in Africa that Uganda supported Rwanda, not because it really cared, but because Rwanda had a border with Congo, and in the end you could move a lot of minerals illegally out of Congo through Rwanda into Uganda and into the hands of legal business. Is it really a case that if CPEC goes well, the assumption will be that Pakistan will work out how to get minerals out of Afghanistan to the railhead somewhere in Pakistan? Do you perceive that China really doesn't want to have to do business somewhere so difficult as Afghanistan, that they'll happily just say to the Pakistanis, look, there's a bounty per kilo on however much lithium you bring out, but you have to bring it to us?
Well, the Chinese are actually already here, actually not too far from where I'm working. The Chinese actually, basically destroyed a couple of basically archaeological sites to get their hands on minerals. So I don't know that they actually are. I don't know how risk averse they are to doing it, but that's a pretty good analogy actually to the DRC. This is only a guess. I would say probably yes, but the thing is that like with the DRC, you don't only have one party in town. You have a number of parties that want to get in on the mineral trade in Afghanistan. You obviously have the Pakistanis and the Chinese, but you also have groups like the Russians and so forth. The other thing that's important to remember is that it's not just minerals. Water is a big part of the equation as well, which is proving, it's every bit as valuable. And water stealing has been a big issue, especially with Pakistan and Iran. So I just wanted to add that part.
So really, because water is so valuable, you might get really solid relationships between individual provinces or individual warlords and a Chinese company where everyone can win locally without any need for Kabul to be in the mix. Because quite simply, they're so divorced from the reality, they can't influence it, so people can go ahead and make their own deals.
Well, that's exactly right. Or they could just go ahead and just steal it themselves. But that's exactly right. And that has been happening right now. Kabul has been really quite furious at both Pakistan and Iran for some time for violating agreements. And these are very old agreements over sharing water in Afghanistan that have been violated repeatedly over the past few years.
So how is Russia ending up in this mix? Are they wanting to exploit minerals as well, or do they just want to sell weapons to everybody? Are they looking to be sellers or buyers in this situation?
I think that they want to be both. But my impression is that Russia obviously wants a sphere of influence, and that accounts for, it's believed that, first of all, Russia has been selling weapons to the Taliban. They're also in bed with the most likely, opposition candidate to Ashraf Ghani, Adenor, up in Balkh province. So I believe that the Russians obviously want to be in the mix, and I think that they do have an interest in the in securing the minerals. I do think that they also want to sell weapons to people.
This is really interesting then. We're in the situation where the West spent so much time there trying to improve security, and yet with this mineral boom and the issue of the value of water, if the West had been able to offer deals early on extracting minerals at a fair price, helping with water infrastructure, it seems that it's just been the most amazing lost opportunity for the dollars and lives invested to have not got some of these economic and water security issues right 10 years ago.
I completely agree with that, and I think that even with the Trump administration, which has been so big on, or at least trumpeted, cutting deals and that sort of thing, that they haven't done more about this.
So it's almost like because we were there for security reasons, we can't conceive of Afghanistan any other way now. And by having such a limited perspective of the place and what it could mean in terms of the future, we undervalue the potential ways we could help.
I think that's absolutely true. And the other thing is that as a result, I think that Afghanistan is very likely to fall prey to the resource-rich curse. Both because of the minerals and because of the water.
So suddenly Congo becomes the most likely, parallel everyone's interested, everyone plays one group off another within the country. It's impossible to sort of maintain central authority in any meaningful way. And we eventually potentially, get an Afghan war that looks something like the major Congo wars, where everybody was in for everything they could get. To the point where in Congo it got to the point where South African special forces didn't want to go home because they were making so much money.
Actually, the Congo analogy is a really good one. I think you're absolutely right about that.
And now we'll take our usual musical interlude. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA. And that was Too Dark to Shine from the 2014 single Precious Journey by the Dal Shah Project. Now we'll return to our examination of Afghanistan. You're listening to Strategikon, episode 47. Albert, of the foreign powers jockeying for influence inside Afghanistan, Iran, an enemy of both Islamic State as well as the United States, is known to have political leverage among Afghanistan's Shiite Hazara communities. Apart from Iranian use of this influence to gain information on US troop movements and the whereabouts of Islamic State and Taliban fighters, is Iranian resolve to carve out a fully functional sphere of influence in Western Afghanistan fictional, or have they actually made progress in this endeavor?
My understanding is that it's not. It's non-fictional. It's very, very real. And one thing to remember is that it's not just the Iranians don't just have soft power. Among the Hazaras who have been, historically repressed. Their role in Afghanistan has been analogous to the role of the Shia in Iraq, say under Saddam Hussein, for example. The Iranians want this for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a hedge against the United States, as a hedge against ISIS. Also, possibly, as I've heard this before, but as a hedge against Pakistan as well. But also as a recruitment center for their adventures in places like Syria. And they have recruited an awful lot of Afghans to go into Syria and go and fight, and they let their families live in Iran for some time.
Albert, a question from Shahrazad. At the beginning of this year, we have seen news articles reporting that people in Afghanistan, especially among the younger generation, are now carrying ID cards in the hope that in the case of an emergency, the doctors and their relatives may be able to find them with these notes. Shahrazad would like to know what the youth of Afghanistan want for their country. Do they want to continue down an ultra-hardline conservative path and follow the Taliban, or do they want to become more liberalized? What's your sense of the situation?
It's extremely hard for me to answer for two reasons. The first is that I'm very restricted in my movement, so I don't get to go out and talk to a lot of people. And also the youth that I'm talking to it's a very very narrow group. So I haven't met anybody who wants the Taliban, last year, for example, even though he's not Taliban, one of the major warlords, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, of the Jamaat Islam Party, moved back into Kabul, and there was a lot of, I guess, fanfare, but there were a lot of demonstrations about it. None of the young people were very happy about it, for obvious reasons. I mean, he's known as the Butcher of Kabul. So, I mean, a lot of the young people that I deal with want the U.S. to stay, but I think that they also want the U.S. to do the bulk of the fighting too, which I think is problematic. But I have not met any of the kids who I teach who are pro-Taliban or pro any of the. It's believed there's around 23 different militant groups within Afghanistan who have said anything that favors them. A lot of them are sick of the endemic corruption in their country, but I have not heard anybody voice sentiments that are pro-Taliban. I think that they want something along the lines of a working democracy, not necessarily liberal in a Western sense, but a much more of a working, functional democracy.
Albert, the kids you're teaching, where do they imagine their futures leading them? Do they see themselves as the next generation of public servants to try and make the system better? Do they imagine political careers to try and make democracy work better? Are they learning English for the day that they believe they will probably finally, follow the trend line of clever, educated people in Afghanistan and flee to the West? Have they got sort of idealism and a plan, or idealism and a suitcase packed for when it gets too bad? What sense do you get?
Frankly, it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I have some students who are clearly planning for a political future, who want to run for public office. With some of my, I call them kids, but they're in their, from their mid to late 20s to even in their early 30s, and they have children of their own. Some of them have jobs in, the various ministries. Some of them, want a political career. Others, are planning, they apply for the Fulbright or the Chevening, or the Dodd Fellowship, and, it's pretty clear that they're going to go and they would very much like to stay. They're very pessimistic about the future of the country.
So it's terrible. You're potentially teaching the people who would be able to think their way through improving it. And yet if they can't see improvements, yes, they can't invest in having their young children grow up and be their age in Kabul. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. A lot of them, or a sizable number, don't believe the country, where they don't believe the country has a healthy future. They just don't believe it's going to be any different than it has been in the past.
Albert, President Trump's international policies to date have been about the retrenchment of American global power. Now, having passed its first-year anniversary, what can you say about America's commitment to Afghanistan security? Has there been a noticeable decline in interest from Washington in supporting its ongoing mission?
Well, I think that on paper and on the ground, it's been, quite the opposite. Trump campaigned on a retrenchment strategy, even almost on an isolationist policy. And one of the first things he did last summer was, we raised the level. We had a mini surge of 5,000 troops. So, but the suspicion among a lot of people is that, we're going to pull out. Now, it's not, this president is known for being inconsistent. The past couple of weeks, first he said we're going to pull out of Syria. Then we got a different statement from Brett McGurk, the presidential envoy for ISIS, that said we're not pulling out of Syria. So President Trump said we're not pulling out. Then he said again, well, we're pulling out of Syria. So I can't say with any certainty what the policy is going to be in Afghanistan. but I think that there's a lot of suspicion that he might end up pulling out troops out of Afghanistan. I mean, it's very hard to predict with this president in particular.
Albert, it's been said that after 3 decades of American military efforts in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is still a hotbed of great power, rivalry, terrorism, and counterinsurgency. But most of all, its economy is still dominated by narco-trafficking, the country being the world's largest illicit opium producer. It is said that every spring the opium harvest fills the Taliban's treasury with money it needs to recruit, equip and train a new gathering of fighters. Can you explain how the spring of 2018 is any different from those that preceded it?
The opium harvest is I have to admit, is not my area of expertise. But from what I understand, it's not any different. And the reason it's not any different is that we try to program, if this was meant to supposedly win hearts and minds, where farmers would be paid to harvest wheat as opposed to harvest opium. The simple fact of the matter is that opium is more valuable than wheat. So I mean that's the simple fact of the matter when it comes to opium harvests. But I don't have specific data on opium.
I know it's related, Albert, and I'm sorry if you can't answer, but an interesting thing from an Australian perspective is very much the unit that came of age for the Australian Army in Afghanistan was 2 Commando. They essentially went from being a second-tier Special Forces unit to a first-tier Special Forces unit. And it was never really clear to Australian civilians how they did it until we started getting memoirs. And it turned out that the real turning point was when the DEA had a fleet of ex-American Special Forces helicopter pilots, a whole pile of Russian helicopters in good condition, and no shooters to leap out of doors and blow up heroin processing plants. And 2 Commando took on the role. So suddenly they were flying around, hitting 3, heroin labs or processing plants a night out of Russian helicopters with American pilots and getting more assault time than just about any unit in Afghanistan ever had. Is the DEA still obviously there in Afghanistan? Is the presence of sort of the anti-drug crusade still obvious, or has everyone realised that as long as heroin, poppies pay for food, pay for people's lives, there's nothing really the West can do?
I don't know the extent of the DEA. I mean, the story you told is very interesting. I don't know the extent of the DEA's involvement. I do know that almost everyone I've talked to has said exactly, the same exact line that you said, which is, I mean, actually, I was talking to a security professional, about wheat, for example, and he said the same thing, is that people are growing poppies so they can provide for their families. I mean, it's not because they're drug dealers necessarily, and they know they're getting ripped off by the Taliban, but I mean, it's exactly that, so they can put bread and butter on the table.
Is the heroin problem obvious in Kabul, or you just don't get to go out and see sort of normal street life? Is there a real... because things have been so difficult for so long, you're teaching the young people who can get an education, can get out with their minds. Is there a large group of young people who are just going, I can't bear this? And is there a massive heroin problem? Or does no one talk about the potential of a massive heroin problem, in an Islamic country?
Certainly no one is talking to me about it. Let me put it that way. I'm not, we have very strict security restrictions, and no, we're not allowed to go out and see that part of Kabul. So, I have not seen anything along those lines of a heroin problem, but it wouldn't terribly surprise me.
Yeah, because some of the coverage from the NGOs, particularly on the risk of hepatitis C, HIV because of the heroin problem. Some of the NGOs are saying it's huge, but no one but them wants to talk about it, and they're only talking about it when they get home here to Australia or the US, and they're trying to get funding, to run a clinic again next year, where they're sort of totally out of step with the anti-drug policy and sort of, whatever the Afghan government thinks about it.
I think that I believe what they're saying. I personally haven't seen it, but it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Albert, on a related topic, recently I saw a documentary by the noted chef Gordon Ramsay on cocaine production in Colombia. Now, One of the things that he raised, and I think that it might very well be relevant to this discussion, is the lack of transport within Colombia prevents farmers from moving away from growing the coca leaf, which is obviously where the cocaine comes from. And so therefore it makes no economic sense to diversify their crop yields into legal crops like, wheat or maize or anything. And the farmer who was actually stomping on his coca leaves at the time that he was being interviewed by Ramsey said, look, no roads, it's much easier for us just to do this, because in little packets we can transship it into a village, and then from the village it goes into the city, and so on and so forth, and hey presto, we have an economy. And of course we know that Colombia is essentially a narco-state. Their entire economy is predicated on the exploitation of cocaine. With regard to Afghanistan, could we also have? Is the problem also analogous to Afghanistan? With lack of infrastructure, lack of roads, lack of incentive for local farmers to move away from growing poppies. Is this a problem that you think might also be at the level in Afghanistan?
I think it's absolutely a problem. I mean, for example, the South Koreans a few years ago, and this is right after the United States invaded, tried building roads, and locals would literally burn down the roads, burn down any of the efforts they were making, because some of them saw it as un-Islamic. And I think that it is definitely part of the problem. I think that I would imagine, I haven't spoken to any farmers, but I would imagine that the situation is analogous, or probably the exact same thing.
So road building has failed as much in Afghanistan now as it sort of, 2002-3, when people were saying then it took forever to get anywhere. Nothing's got any faster. It still takes forever to get anywhere.
That's absolutely right. Most of the roads are dirt roads.
So what happened to the nation building? I mean, it's a facetious question, I know.
Well, quite frankly, I think you know the answer, which is that the nation building has failed. And part of it is that, there's actually a terrific book by David Lake from UC San Diego called State Building. And basically he talks about the reasons why, it's so difficult to actually go abroad and build the state. It's failed colossally. And I don't see it getting any better. So now he uses Somalia as a proxy for Afghanistan, but we poured a ton of money into this country, and unfortunately, we have very little to show for it.
Is that partly to do with the fact that it was kind of like set within a neoliberal economic agenda where everything is kind of like an outsourced US company or Western company that goes into Afghanistan, reaps in the profits from, basically law-abiding taxpayers in the West, and makes money hand over fist only to pack up stumps and go home with nothing to show for it? Was there a sort of almost rapine effect on the nation-building project by the companies that were tasked for it, went in there and just set up what they thought was this fantastic nation-building infrastructure, only to take the money, say thank you very much for the money, and leave the Afghans as poverty-struck as before?
I think that's part of it, but I also think that, we also poured a lot of money into different little, Afghan companies, and we have very little to show for it, too. We have, it's just, I think I do not, it's like Bismarck once said, a nation, what is it? A nation is built on an anvil of iron and blood. Well, we have plenty of iron and blood to show for this, but we still don't have the very basic things. We don't, you look at, you just go into, you go into Kabul, the traffic is absolutely impossible. It's almost on, it makes Tehran look, like it's easy to get a cab, for example. It's just impossible. And the political problems have contributed to it too. Yeah, I think so far we failed egregiously.
So without security, you don't have trust. Without trust, you can't build an economy. So really, we didn't ever get past square one.
Yeah, we haven't gotten past. We got past it
and fell back to it.
2002, and then we went into Iraq.
Yeah.
So
fell backwards.
So
Okay, Albert, thanks very much for being with us. That brings this episode to a close, and we look forward to hearing from you next time.
okay.
Okay,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategikon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.